Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, and welcome to this live broadcast. I'm joined by Chip Gibbons. Chip is the policy director for the Defending Rights and Dissent organization, civil liberties organization in DC. And we're going to talk about this panel that was organized by the Hayden Center for Intelligence, which is at the George Mason University. But it wasn't held at the university. It was held in a room at the National Press Club on December 5th. So welcome, Chip. Welcome.
Thank you for having me back, Kevin.
And this panel was called The Case of Julian Assange, not the case against Julian Assange, but the case of Julian Assange.
Very really 19th century novel sounding, like The Strange Case of Mr. Assange.
Which really tells you that they wanted to talk about Assange, the person, more than the case itself, and what Assange represents to the U.S. government, more than the fact that there is this unprecedented case. But we'll get to all those details. But first, we should lay out that the people on the panel were on the side of Assange. You had Barry Pollack, who is the U.S. attorney for Assange. And so that was good. It was good that he was included. And then two, you had Gabe Rottman, who is a director at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And then you had on the other side in the camp that would be anti-Assange and have been openly anti-Assange before. You had Mark Zaid. And my description of Mark Zaid, you can add in any details, but my description of Mark Zaid for people is that he's a very DC whistleblower attorney, somebody who's helped individuals with navigating pre-publication review. He knows the ins and outs of the national security state, but he's also been openly hostile and aggressive and opposes people like Thomas Drake and the way they went about blowing the whistle on the NSA. He despises people like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning for the way that they made their disclosures. He's been aggressively against John Kiriakou, and he does not like Julian Assange. And in fact, he was also involved for a time as Jeffrey Sterling's lawyer until he was subpoenaed by the grand jury and called to testify as a fact witness. And then he relinquished his position and no longer was part of Jeffrey Sterling's legal team. And we don't really know what happened, but presumably he would have spoken against his client during those grand jury proceedings.
And Barry Pollack was Sterling's attorney at trial, right? I think so.
Yes.
The way Jeffrey Sterling explains it in his book, and I know the story you're telling, and I've heard that one as well, is that Zaid is not a criminal defense attorney. So when the process became criminal, he went to Barry Pollack. But I do know there are allegations about how Mark Zaid conducted himself during that grand jury. I don't know the veracity of them, but the story Sterling tells in his memoir is that Zaid was the civil attorney, or whatever he does. I don't know. It's not really civil either. And then Pollack was the criminal defense attorney. And it's also really weird and worth mentioning that Zaid was apparently also Chelsea Manning's attorney for pre-publication review. They made a big deal of that on the panel, even though he has attacked people like Snowden and Manning for going to the media. One of his big things is, I won't represent people who leak information. They're criminals.
Yeah. So ideologically, to me, what he represents is this kind of like left of center person, a DC attorney who has this devout worship of the law and how it is, it is the answer. It is the thing that you must follow. It will always be right. If the government does something, they must be doing it by the book or the rules. And, if they can hide behind the law, if they can take corruption and hide it behind the law, what can I say? They've invoked the law.
It's a phrase that the DC NGOs that are not defending rights and dissent use is lawful whistleblowers, right? They talk about this category of what they call lawful whistleblowers. And I would say that he is indicative of an ideology that makes a distinction between quote unquote lawful whistleblowers those who follow the official channels, which, you know, we can discuss why I think that's bullshit, versus those who go to the American people and go to the media, which
Yeah.
I guess that's unlawful whistleblowing. I would never use that dichotomy or framework for a bunch of reasons, and I know you wouldn't either. But that's the inside the Beltway brain rot.
So let's get to this fourth person who was not a known entity to me until this panel. And I can't say that I am gratified to now know that this person exists in our world. But this individual, Holden Triplett, the founder of Trenchcoat Advisors. I love the introduction that he got where that guy Pfeiffer, who is a former CIA official, said something like he was really like, ooh, what a great name. Isn't that cool sounding, or something like that, when he heard that Holden's with Trenchcoat Advisors, or when he was reading the introduction. But Holden, more importantly, rather than having this kind of like firm that is taking advantage of his national security connections, he is somebody who was at the FBI for 14 years. I have his profile in front of me. He was a supervisory special agent. He was a legal attaché. He was an assistant legal attaché. He was a supervisory special agent, and he was a special agent. And he did this all the way back to 2006. And then for a couple of years, he was part of the Office of the Director for Counterintelligence in the National Security Council at the White House. That was from 2017 to 2018 in the Trump administration. So,
And he was stationed in Moscow and Beijing.
okay.
Which is the other thing that the guy introducing him made a big deal out. He said most FBI agents never go overseas, which is true because they're not the CIA, they're not the NSA, they're supposed to be domestic. He's like, he was stationed in Moscow and Beijing, so he knows what actually repressive governments look like. The indication being that people who were saying Julian Assange was repressed by the United States were misinformed, and if they had the job of collaborating with GRU, I mean, like, as a legal attaché, he was not supposed to be doing hostile things against those governments. I don't believe they would know what actual repression looks like. Yeah, he's a very creepy figure.
Okay, so let's do, it's not really a disclaimer, but just a way to understand this video. And just to be fair to Gabe and Barry, they gave some excellent comments and some remarks. We are not going to be dealing with those comments on this show exclusively. We may recall some of them and speak about what was said. There may be snippets, but we're not really going to do justice to the remarks that they gave during the panel, because what's more important to us is to question and pick apart the things that were said by the two panelists that were there to represent this national security state viewpoint that is anti-Assange. And so I just want people to know that, Barry did a pretty good job of representing his role in the Assange case. I'd say Gabe did a pretty good job of representing his role as the representative of a press freedom organization that, generally speaking, does not support what the Justice Department has chosen to do in using its powers to go after Assange. And so, with that, I have Holden queued up, because this is really the first moment. And maybe you want to, I'll just say here that Holden is, what you're going to see is there's this moderator who I don't know where she comes from. I don't know why, but I don't know why she was picked to be the moderator. She doesn't have any specific knowledge, or at Newsy, she wrote one post about the fact that Assange was indicted, and this was back in 2019, I think. So did a lot of every journalist who worked at any organization and they were involved in national security. But she has a back. She actually had a job at the State Department at some point, and so she is now at Newsy, some small outfit that seems like very much like maybe this kind of State Department funded outfit that would help the U.S. government disseminate stories about China or Russia or other countries. with things that were developing that were of interest to people who want to advance the U.S. military narrative. And I don't know. I'm not saying that they really are. I'm just like the way she carried herself. It was clear that she didn't have any particular expertise on this case. She read from a laptop screen the whole time, and it didn't look like without the laptop that she would be able to just listen to what people were saying and respond and then move the panel discussion like a moderator is supposed to be able to do. I think she would have been completely lost without a laptop.
Yeah, she also started off, I was impressed they gave Barry the opening question. And at the beginning, it seemed like maybe it'd be a little bit more even or balanced. But later on, she asked Barry that question about what's
Yeah,
okay.
We'll show it. So here's Holden. I've got Holden queued up, but what I'm going to show you is, Barry's been talking. Barry Pollack has been giving all of these specifics about the case, and he digs into the things that you've heard about the password cracking conspiracy that aren't true. You've heard that WikiLeaks dumped files on the internet, and he describes and really very meticulously outlines why that isn't true. And he's picking apart the U.S. government's own case based upon how it has been brought against his client, Julian Assange. And then you have this happen. So we'll put this up here. So
also puts it on WikiLeaks site. And so what the government has...
I'm sorry, I'm just going to leave it there because I want to turn to somebody else at this point.
Absolutely.
Holden Triplett, you heard this specific description of the course of events. I want to get your take.
Sure, thanks very much. Let me just start off by saying I am not with the government, nor do my views are my own at this point. I'm not representing the views of the US government or the FBI specifically. So I think maybe we can just take a step back, because I'm not sure if what we want to do up here is sort of completely litigate the specifics of the case. And just think about what we're actually dealing with here. And I think it's important to think of the entire narrative and the arc of the organization. And that helps inform why the government is so concerned about this. And what we have essentially is an organization that has called itself essentially an intelligence agency that is trying to inform the people of the world, and has said that they want to hack to bring that information out and to publish it. Now, again, this is an organization that has generally been used against a number of different governments within the world, but has worked specifically very hard against the US government. It is not a US entity. Assange is not a US citizen. So again, injecting themselves in our conversation here, in our dynamic of figuring out what is the balance between security and privacy in this sense. And so I think it's important to think about who is the actor that we're talking about here before we start to get into the specifics about what might be misconceptions that are out there. So there's two basic charges within the superseding well, there's 18 charges, but two basic ones, which essentially is there's a computer hacking charge, and then there's the charges under the Espionage Act. And so as Barry laid out, there is at least a narrative that's out there about whether or not the hacking, how big of a part that played in the overall exploitation of receiving information, or whether it was a part of it that was necessary in order to get the information out. But I'm not sure that actually matters for whether or not the case, if someone actually has broken the law in order they're making an attempt to actually extract additional information. So while it may or may not be, and again, I think we should stay kind of a little bit on the wave tops here on the specifics of this, may or may not be actually impactful on the information that's coming out, if Assange took these actions, essentially was encouraging someone and actually trying to help them to hack into a US government system, that is a violation of US law. And that is not someone who's protected in terms of publishing that information. Generally, that is not something that the Supreme Court has decided to protect in those types of actions.
Okay, I'm going to pause there.
Okay. The best part's still coming. I just want the viewers.
The best part is coming, but there is one little bit of setup I want to do. But go ahead. You want to say anything about what Holden just said there?
I mean, what is there to say to this? I mean, Barry has pretty thoroughly debunked the misconceptions about Julian Assange. Holden Triplett's idea that before we can discuss misconceptions, let's discuss who WikiLeaks is, and then gives this propagandist depiction of them is, I mean, Triplett knows what he's doing here, and I don't want to litigate the case. I mean, I wonder why, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he doesn't ever actually engage with what WikiLeaks revealed. He doesn't ever actually engage with the case against Julian Assange. He discussed his questions with the moderator beforehand. He tips that off later in the panel, which I don't know if everyone got that or just him. I mean, I've definitely done panels where I've let everyone know what I'm going to ask, right? Because they're not like hostile panels. So, but he comments on one of the questions later on that this isn't one of the ones we discussed. And like, he just is giving this extraordinarily propagandistic view of WikiLeaks. They claim they're an intelligence agency. I mean, go back and look at all of the publications in the 70s and 80s that are reporting on the CIA and the FBI. You know, who watches the say who watches the watch, but like, like the government's spying on you, so we're reporting on the government. I mean, Defending Rights to Dissent has repeatedly said the FBI investigates dissent, so we're going to investigate the FBI. We're not an intelligence agency, right? That is a common bit of rhetorical move that people who report on critical information about the intelligence state, about domestic security uses. So that's already, and then it gets to this point where he's not American and he's asserting himself in our debate about the lines between privacy or secrecy and public disclosure. And the only reason Julian Assange is part of the US debate about secrecy versus public disclosure is because the United States government is prosecuting him and his sources for disclosing public information, right? He didn't say, I'm going to start a debate about the First Amendment in the US. He said, I have newsworthy information about war crimes, about abuses of power, and I'm going to work with the New York Times, The Guardian, El País, Le Monde, and other papers to publish them. And then the US government decided, let's have a debate about, secrecy versus transparency. So it's just incredibly propagandistic framing. It's subtle at parts, it's not subtle at other parts, and it just, I mean, it's indicative of his worldview, but as I'll explain later, I got an even scarier insight into his worldview, and by comparison, his comments are quite restrained compared to what he said to me after the panel, which was the most disturbing conversation I've ever had in Washington, D.C.
So we'll keep people in suspense and save that for the end here as we're winding down our broadcast. But I just hear multiple times say that he wants to stay up on the wave tops and he's not going to get into the weeds or talk about the specifics. And I have to ask myself, does he even really know what he's talking about? Is he qualified to talk about this case? Because there's nothing in this panel that gives me a sense that he knows about the chain of events that unfolded in 2010 and 2011. And as you're going to see here, I think that's borne out by the fact that Barry Pollack, before this, describes what happened with David Lee of The Guardian, who was an editor, a lead editor at The Guardian, who Julian Assange wrote down on a piece of paper, a password, and gave it to him so that he could open an encrypted file. And that encrypted file would give them access to U.S. State Embassy cables, the U.S. State Department cables, these cables that were over 250,000 files that Chelsea Manning provided to WikiLeaks. And he publishes the password in his book, which he co-authors with Luke Harding. And this tell-all book about working with WikiLeaks that contains a lot of attacks that are borderline slander against Assange and WikiLeaks that feed into these narratives that the Pentagon and other U.S. government agencies are pushing in 2011 and beyond. It eventually, there are individuals out there, as people may know, that figure out that they have found the file and, let's try this password that was put in the book by David Lee and see if it might open this encrypted file. And then it does. And then there's a lot of danger because all of the files in the cache of documents not just the ones that have been published, but the ones that have not been published yet, including ones that have not been curated and gone over so that sources could be protected. Those are now going to be available for everyone to read, no matter what, whether WikiLeaks puts them on their website or not. So anyways, that's my rundown for people, so you understand what this next part is. And so let's hear Holden tell everyone what he thinks about this. These are facts, by the way. This isn't some theory. Barry Pollack lays out the facts of what happened with The Guardian, David Lee, and these cables becoming publicly available to everyone on the internet. And then how WikiLeaks called the State Department and they were like, you should do something. People are going to be in trouble. And then to that, this is how a former FBI agent on the panel responds.
The second, what is a very nuanced and complicated piece of it, I don't know the specifics of this, but I can tell you what it smells like. It smells like an intelligence operation to me. This is a very typical sort of tactic of how Russian intelligence works. They use individuals and they use people as proxies, and many times they may be unwitting in which ways they would do that. Sometimes they may be witting in order to leak this type of information. So creating a situation where there was it was told it was a temporary password to some person so that they could push this information out, versus saying that it was a permanent password that could be unchanged. This is the type of information that a Russian intelligence service, this is how they would operate in order to push that information out.
Really quickly, with the names that were ultimately revealed in the...
Okay.
This is completely bonkers, right? This is unhinged. I mean, you could, if you want to make the case that WikiLeaks is a Russian intelligence agency, which, I think is a bullshit case, like, even conceding you could do a less unhinged job than this. I mean, the idea that, I don't even know where you start with. I mean, I, like you, I've written about the series of events by which the State Department cables, unredacted, became available. They're an extremely convoluted set of facts, right? The idea that WikiLeaks purposefully told David Lee it was a temporary password, knowing that he would then make it the chapter title in his book 3 months later, and then 7 months later, a German website would figure this out.
Man,
right?
He had some elite KGB training. If that's
and also that's a typical Russian tactic. WikiLeaks could have just published all the information on the website. The Russians could have made like a cutout organization and done this. If this is a typical Russian espionage tactic, then what this tells me is that GRU is extraordinarily convoluted and not very, very smart, and that they're very lucky that this harebrained scheme of telling someone something is a temporary password, hoping they then publish it as a chapter in their book, and then 7 months later, German newspaper figures it out. It confounds any basic sense of reason. And this is what this guy does. He just keeps saying, this is typical Russian this is typical Russian that. You don't know this, but right now you're engaging in typical Russian disinformation. And it's just like, I don't know.
Yeah. So what we know is that David Lee was technologically illiterate and a nimwit. And
I'm technologically illiterate and a nimwit as well, so I sympathize somewhat here.
But we also know that he was a nimwit to a fault, because
yes,
people like Italian journalist Stefania Marizzi, who can tell you stories about working and collaborating with WikiLeaks, and she does so in great detail in her English. You should pick up the English translation of her book, Secret Power: WikiLeaks and Its Enemies, about what it was like to collaborate and work with WikiLeaks, the reality of working with WikiLeaks, not the espionage fantasy that is being spun by Holden Triplett and other FBI agents out there who get paid to speak about this when they have no idea about anything in this case. The reality is that there were really strict security procedures that had to be followed when people were using these documents, when they were opening these files. Access could be gone in like an hour or two, depending on what files were sent. Putting the encrypted file out on the internet was a standard thing to do, but you would download it and you wouldn't ever tell anybody what you used to open that encrypted file, because that would be how that file could be out there available for those people around the world to access it and open those files and do work globally. This is what enabled media partners to do the work that was necessary for their newspapers in order to talk about what these cables showed about these specific countries. And meanwhile, you had people like David Lee, who I understand were getting impatient with WikiLeaks because they had all these strict security protocols and they thought this was slowing everything down. And we want to go, we want to publish their stories. We want to get our headlines and everything out there and tell people about this. Why do we have to wait, Julian Assange? Stop telling us we have to wait, Julian Assange. We're ready to go.
Yeah, no, I've read Secret Power. It's an excellent book. I mean, and the descriptions of the security protocols for the Iraq war logs, Afghan war logs, and State Department cables are pretty strict. I believe in one depiction, Stefania mentioned she has to use an air-gapped, airlocked computer. It can't be a computer that connects to the internet to open up a USB. They write part of the password down on a paper, but not the full password. She has to memorize part of it, and just, I mean, I'm terrible at memorizing passwords. If I got this USB drive, I probably would not be able to open it. So I am a nimwit and technologically illiterate. So I don't think I would have done very successful in this case. But the idea that there is some sort of plot that through other people's folly and bad luck and this is typical Russian actions. And the other thing I will point out is that Mr. Triplett starts off by acknowledging he knows nothing here. It just smells this way.
Okay, so let's go forward to when Barry Pollack is essentially someone who becomes the target of a modern day McCarthyist question of, is your client connected to the Russians? Can you tell us about the relationship that Julian Assange has with the Russian government? I kid you not. She straight up asked the moderator from Newsy, whatever that is, asks Barry Pollack about here, we'll get this queued up here.
The framing of the question is just
so here we go.
Some of the subtleties of the different administrations and what we think will happen with the Biden administration in a bit. But now I want to step out a little bit of this specific case to talk a little bit more about Julian Assange. And I'm sending this question again to you, Barry. Julian Assange.
Sorry, I just want to say something. Again, like, it's not just the two people who are for Assange, it's the moderator too, who are like uncomfortable with dealing with the specifics. But you would think that a panel that is organized during a prosecution against Julian Assange because of this case would stick to the case itself. And they're also in an academic setting where I would think that like there should be this grounding of our comments in those things that can be proven, that are factually true. And those are like, that's like the allegations in the indictment. Those are the things we should talk about, that the US government are trying to bring against Julian Assange to prosecute him and convict him. They're going to go to a courtroom and they're going to have to find a way to prove those allegations in order to get the verdict that they want. And they very consciously have not chosen to bring some of these claims that are being talked about outside the scope of this indictment, which these people insist on talking about. Sorry, I just had to
Can I say one thing real quick?
Yeah.
The framing of the panel on social media was, is Julian Assange a modern day journalist or a techno spy? I'll note the qualifiers before both journalist and spy. It's very strange. So they were definitely trying to set this up on a debate on, is Assange a spy or a journalist, which is not really what's being alleged. I don't know what a techno spy is.
Yeah, but that's also like, that my complaint about all organizations, especially media organizations, but usually ones that are pretty state identified in their portrayals of national security matters is that, like, look, I said the thing I said about Ingber, who is the moderator when she first spoke, was she said something about how, like, this is a very polarizing case, or Julian Assange is a very polarizing individual. That's a very trite thing, but I've heard it over and over again for the last 12 years, and it tells us nothing. Usually you can, if you want to know that somebody doesn't really understand this case, the first immediate red flag is if they frame any conversation about this by saying, is Julian Assange a whistleblower or a spy? Because they're just being very reductive. They used to do this with Chelsea Manning too. They'd be like, is she a hero or a traitor? I'd be like, I would know right away that you don't really know much about this case, and you're just using this very boring, mundane framing that doesn't actually get to the core of what's going on in this case. And it's just one of my more biggest pet peeves of how people have talked about these individuals. So here we go. So now Barry Pollack is going to be asked directly about Julian Assange in Russia.
Had a show on RT, formerly Russia Today. He published materials that were hacked by the Russian government from the DNC. He advised Edward Snowden to go to Russia. And according to Foreign Policy, he declined to publish a trove of documents that were hacked, that were from the Russian government, showing wrongdoing that other places ultimately published, which revealed new information. So can you explain what is Assange's relationship with Russia?
Assange has zero relationship with Russia. That is part of, there's a bit of a misinformation campaign, and we've heard some of it tonight. It was not a Russian conspiracy that got a journalist from The Guardian to inadvertently publish a password. The Russians had nothing to do with the Bradley Manning leaks, which is the subject of the Assange prosecution. You would make an excellent lawyer because you've already learned the trick that if you don't like the facts of your case, you talk about the facts of some other case. Assange isn't the one who made the decision to leak this material and made the decision that the public ought to know that the US government was lying about civilian casualties, that it had murdered unarmed Reuters staff members. It was Bradley Manning whose conscience made the decision to leak this material. And it was the New York Times and The Guardian, all the publications that signed that letter, and Julian Assange, who made the decision to publish that information. And that is an editorial decision. Some of us might agree with that editorial decision. Some of us might disagree with that editorial decision. But up until this prosecution, while the government has flirted on a couple of occasions otherwise, we have always taken the position that the United States government is not the editor-in-chief, not just for the United States, but for the world. And we allow publishers to make those decisions. And we're willing to live with sometimes some bad editorial decisions we don't like, because the opposite, letting the government control what gets published, is worse. And that's why this prosecution, I think, is different, and it's why people are and should be talking about it, and it's why mainstream journalists are concerned about it. In terms.
Okay, so
I want them to see what the moderator does here. Could you let it go a little bit longer? I know.
yeah. Well, I'm setting something up. So,
okay.
So just so people take that all in, he's just very directly dealt with the question. He said no. There is no relationship between my client and the Russian government. And also, let me tell you about the thing that Holden was talking about with the password and David Lee, and how that could not be a part of some Russian conspiracy. And so he deals with it. He very directly deals with it. So now let's continue.
In terms of the hacking versus the espionage
Well,
act.
I'm sorry, but I
Yeah.
asked about his relationship with Russia.
And I answered that. He has none.
Okay. Well, then I want to move on to whether or not, Holden, you think that WikiLeaks should register as a foreign agent, as we saw RT had to a couple years ago.
That wasn't a question we talked about. No,
That wasn't a question
I'm
we
happy
talked
to go after
about
Barry.
beforehand. That wasn't a question we talked about beforehand. I want to make an observation here. This is the second time she interrupts a panelist during this panel when they're speaking. Both times the panelist is Barry Pollack. Only one questioner during the question and answers period gets interrupted while asking a question. It was me. I was asked if I in fact had a question, and I've moderated panels and I hate people who speechify instead of asking questions. So I'm slightly sympathetic to her there, but like she clearly is hostile to Barry. She's clearly hostile to Assange's case, and she is clearly giving the game up here, and she refuses to accept that Assange has no relationship with Russia, and she has this follow-up with should he have to register it under FARA like RT. Was she expecting Barry to describe a relationship with Russia? I'm like, what the fuck are we watching here?
Yeah, no, I mean, like, honestly, was she thinking that she was just going to ask this question and, oh my gosh, I just got this amazing scoop here that Julian Assange is actually a Russian plant, and his U.S. attorney just confessed to it in the middle of this panel at the National Press Club. My career is made. Oh my, look at me.
Newsy wins the Pulitzer. Pulitzer from Paul's Newsy.
And the way that she says, well, I asked you about Russia, and he goes, and I answered it. And she's like, but, and then she like insists, like she can't believe that she didn't get anywhere. And then she pushes on to ask the next question to Holden, which is to directly ask if Julian Assange should register as a Russian agent or some shit. But obviously, if he's not got any relationship like his U.S. attorney just told you, then the question, you have to throw it out. It's a garbage question.
If you listen to sort of her vocal tones and like under her breath, like she does not accept that he would even say he has no relationship with Russia, right? Like he should be ashamed of himself for not confessing his client is an agent of the Russian government. Also, why would Julian Assange have to register under FARA? As Holden Triplett said before, he's not a U.S. citizen. He does not operate in the U.S., right? Like FARA does not apply to Australians in Iceland, right? We don't like go to Iceland or like, aha, you doing things over here in Iceland, you're a foreign agent.
That's true. He would have to be on U.S. soil to register under
US,
FARA.
yes, it's in completely ignorant question. But like, let's hear what Holden has to say.
Yeah. Okay.
Or
So
have
here we go.
mannerism.
I am a lawyer, by the way. I've just been in recovery from
Feel free to
the law
respond.
profession for a few years here. But should he register? It's a really good question. But
No,
I
it's
think
not.
let's just take a step
No,
back.
it's
I think we can talk about the intricacies of the case and what the government has
not.
decided to prosecute, whether it's the best case or not. What does it mean ultimately? But I think if, in the end, I think we actually had to think a
I
little.
didn't plant that.
No.
Cell phone went off in the audience. Very annoying.
But I think we have to think about what is the government's motivation here? What is the government thinking about, and what are they concerned about, right? And so we have I think there's a different Assange in the early 2000s or even 2010 versus Assange in 2016 or even Assange today. There's a distinct evolution of patterns of activity and interactions with certain types of agencies. So whether he has any relationship, which, as I understand, that can be defined in all sorts of different ways with the Russian government, he had substantial interaction with the GRU, which is the military intelligence unit within the government there. Substantial coordination with them on the releasing of information. Again, I think we have to think about what is the value to the U.S., to the population of releasing information about one side of a political campaign, but not the other. And clearly stating a position, if you read deep into the Mueller report, stating a position on who he wanted to win in the US election, which clearly swayed some of his desires to put out some information to hurt a particular side. Now, are these the activities of a journalist? Are these the activities of a publisher who's concerned about getting information into the public space to ensure that the American public is informed? Or is this someone who wants to sway public opinion in a particular way that has an agenda?
Yes.
So one more thing, I just want everyone to kind of sit back and have a thought experiment.
Okay.
If a Russian intelligence agency wanted to...
Wait, hold on. I'll get to his thought experiment.
Thought experiment. I'm gonna have an aneurysm with. I'll have to call 911.
I'll get to the thought experiment, but first we have to deal with this. So, okay, if you publish information that's just on one side, then that's like not allowed. That's not how journalism works. That's just not how journalism works. I don't have to. If I get a cache of documents on the Democratic Party, I don't have to sit here and go, well, where's the ones on the Republicans? Because if I don't get ones on the Republicans, I can't put this out in an election year. I might get accused of swaying an election. That's not how journalism works.
I mean, we can debate about what is good journalism ethics or what a journalist should or should not do. But as Gabe pointed out elsewhere in the panel, I mean, the First Amendment, the government doesn't define who or what is a journalist. This idea that if you have an agenda or you want to sway public opinion, you're not a journalist. I mean, that could be someone's idealized perception of journalism. I hate to break it to you, but many publishers of publications do wish to sway public opinion.
What was CNN during the Trump administration when they were trying to communicate like how democracy was crumbling?
Even tabling that, like the National Review clearly wants to sway public opinion. The Nation wants to sway public opinion, right? One of the things the First Amendment gives us the right to do is to, in fact, the reason we have a First Amendment, freedom of the press, because at the time of the drafting of the First Amendment, the news media was much more openly partisan. Like all of newspapers were associated with a political party, was because you have a right to write a newspaper, write articles, share your opinion, and disseminate information in order to disseminate in order to sway public opinion. And this is a constant thing. We saw this during the J20 Trump protester trial, where she's like, oh, he can't be a journalist. He sympathizes with the protesters. Or when Amy Goodman was indicted over Standing Rock stuff, and the prosecutor's like, oh, she's not a journalist. She's sympathetic to the Standing Rock, right? Like advocacy journalism is a thing. Whether or not you think journalists should like submit blank ballots at election time and do, right? You can have those views, but that has nothing to do with the First Amendment freedom of the press, which very clearly protects the right to engage in political advocacy and the right to engage in journalism with the intent to advocate for things. So this entire framing is just, I mean, he says I'm a lawyer, but I'm in recovery. I mean, it's completely ignorant of the First Amendment and what it protects, but very common, unfortunately, tactic.
Yeah. All right, so let's get to this thought experiment, and try not to completely lose it, and I hope that you're still with us after we're finished here with this remark.
Clearly stating a position, if you read deep into the Mueller report, stating a position on who he wanted to win in the U.S. election, which clearly swayed some of his desires of a journalist. Or is this someone who wants to sway public opinion in a particular way that has an agenda?
An agenda.
So one more thing, I just want everyone to kind of sit back and have a thought experiment. If a Russian intelligence agency wanted to create a publisher that they could manipulate and use, what would that look like? And would that same publishing agency, that publishing unit, would that get First Amendment protection? Could the GRU claim First Amendment protection because they've published information that's in the interest of the American public? Should they get First Amendment protection? Are there any limits to First Amendment protection? So the answer is, of course, there are a lot of limits that have been put out there. And so I think we have to really think about what are we dealing with here, right? And there's a clear evolution of this organization from early on in 2000 to what we're dealing with now. And whether the relationship is there between the Russian government and Assange, there's clearly interaction and there's clearly coordination. We can call it whatever we want.
Interesting. Well, maybe there will be questions from the audience about this, but moving forward.
It's not interesting. It's bullshit.
I mean, I did the thought experiment, Kevin. I thought up a publisher that the GRU you would like, and I did not think of WikiLeaks. So I guess I've nullified his thought experiment. I mean, I don't know where you even start with this, right? The implication of this thought experiment is the publisher I am thinking of is WikiLeaks. As I said, I sat there doing the thought experiment. I didn't think of WikiLeaks. Sorry, Holden. And then this GRU, does the GRU have First Amendment protections? I mean, what he's doing is really insidious here because he continuously states, I don't actually know anything. But what if? And then he sort of engages in this insinuation, right? If you do this thought experiment, you'll think of WikiLeaks. Therefore, WikiLeaks is a product of the GRU. That's not evidence at all. That's just, these are my feelings. And therefore, they're the GRU. Oh, so you're saying the GRU has First Amendment protections? It's completely, nonsensical. I mean, the GRU does not have First Amendment protections. I mean, that's not what we're debating, but they've offered no proof that WikiLeaks is a Russian intelligence operative. They make no acknowledgement of the fact that he worked with the New York Times, Le Monde, El País, etc., and released this information. Are they also part of this Russian plot, or are they just unwitting agents? I know the answer or I can guess the answer because I talked to this man after the panel and got some very disturbing insights into his
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a minute.
thoughts on the civil rights movement.
But so so I don't believe that he knows anything about the 2010-2011 era of WikiLeaks and what is at issue in the case. And even though Barry Pollack laid out some facts, I don't think his brain was capable of retaining it. In fact, maybe that's why he looks like he's under a lot of stress as he is trying to deliver his answers, because he's just met with all this information and it's overwhelming him, and he wants to stay on the wave tops and just surf the waves and not get into the specifics with he's got this like wavy surfer hair. And so but I do think that Holden knows about Robert Mueller and Robert Mueller's investigation and the allegations against WikiLeaks and what was said about WikiLeaks and Donald Trump, what was said about Donald Trump and Russia, and all the things that were said about Russia trying to sway the 2016 election. So we certainly would know that nobody, as far as I can tell, has ever said that Julian Assange met with the GRU in order to get these documents and publish them on the internet. That he talks about these relationships, he talks about these interactions. There are no specifics. He doesn't talk about any evidence that any of this shit ever happened. And yet, like, he goes on and on. But the theory that was always put forward, which I don't think that's been proven, but the theory that was put forward is that they unwittingly published documents from Russian intelligence. And then, having been found out that those documents came from Russian intelligence, they refused to concede and admit that it came from state actors in Russia. That, to me, is what the Mueller investigation was trying to confirm, and what people who attacked WikiLeaks during 2016 election and their conduct during the 2016 election, that's what they were talking about. Now, he's doing something else. He's, as you're saying, much more insidious, because he's actually saying that Assange has aligned himself with the GRU and is working with Russian intelligence.
I'm going to have to dissent a little bit here.
What, did you hear something else? Do I have that wrong?
No. Joe Lauria, during the question and answer period of Consortium News, asked him highly specific questions from the Chelsea Manning court-martial and about the Mueller investigation that undermines his whole presentation. And if I recall correctly, Triplett conceded Lauria's points. So I actually think he does know that all of this is irrelevant. He does know this has nothing to do with anything, and he is choosing to engage in this propagandistic presentation willingly. I don't think he's an unwitting active measures campaign of the Pentagon. I think he is a knowing propagandist. And that part of the reason why he keeps saying, I'm not going to litigate the case, I'm going to ride on top of the waves, is because he knows that that information is not where he's going to win. I mean, he was the, what was he again? He was the director for counterintelligence at the National Security Council in 2017. I don't know what year he left, but that potentially puts him in the National Security Council after Vault 7 is published.
Yeah,
right?
it does. It's true.
After all of these, what was it called? Offensive counterintelligence activities from the CIA against Assange that multiple people with the National Security Council raised legal concerns with, and some of them anonymously went to Yahoo with. So he's potentially sitting there when they're plotting to kidnap Julian Assange, and then National Security Council lawyers like, no, don't do that. So I really don't buy this guy's all shucks, I don't know anything performance here. I think he's a very dangerous man.
Okay, so I have a couple clips marked, and I'm not trying to make any puns here, for Mark, and I want to do those, and
Sure.
and then we'll close with you talking about your interaction with this man Holden. But I don't want to let Mark Zaid off the hook here, because there were a couple things that he said that
He's
really
lucky to be on a panel where he's not the most insidious person. It was
need to
really
be highlighted.
Yeah.
So this first thing that I want to show here is it came really close to the end of it. I think it was right before questions were taken. By the way, the Q&A was very short for what it's worth. I'm sure that they only took like 5 questions. And so I imagine you were in the room. I bet there were 10 or 15 people who didn't get to ask questions. But that being said, this is Mark Zaid, and he's talking about, he's making this case that he believes that Julian Assange could get a fair trial.
Whether or not they're tied to other countries, that's all up for the U.S. government to have to prove or argue. I guess I'll end with this notion, because we hear this a lot from the Assange supporters, that they don't
Assange
expect
supporters
that he could get a fair trial here in the United States. And I will just throw out there that there are a lot of people, as much as I can draw fault with a lot of aspects of the U.S. justice system for sure, and do, you can be convicted after receiving a fair trial. And if the notion of Assange being extradited here, which is probably what's going to happen, but you never know, we'll see what happens in the British and the European system. The notion of it has to be on both sides to accept the fact that a fair trial can mean acquittal, and if that's the case and the U.S. government can't prove it, so be it. But it could also mean a conviction, and that still means that there was a fair trial.
Thank you. So,
okay, so I had to play that. I had to.
What does that even mean? I have many faults with the justice system, but you can be convicted after a fair trial. That isn't saying Julian Assange is getting a fair trial. It's just saying if you have a fair trial, you could be convicted. It's vapid.
Well, what he's trying to do is a service to the national security state.
No, I know what he's trying to do.
Yeah, no, he's trying to say that if we get outraged that Julian Assange is convicted, that doesn't necessarily mean he was railroaded. But here's the thing, this is where he really outs himself, I think, as someone who should not be trusted. He should not be trusted to advise you if you are facing legal jeopardy and could be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And I mean it. I don't know, I have very limited power, and I think I have very limited range to get this video out to people. But if by some chance you are out there and you work for a U.S. government agency, particularly a national security agency, and you're looking for somebody to consult, and you've seen this man's name, Mark Zaid, out there, and you think, okay, I am going to go call him up and ask him if I do this, if I go to this committee, or if I reveal this and give this to this journalist, or if I do this, what do I have to do in order to protect myself? I'm going to say, don't trust this person. Why? Because he does not take seriously what has happened to a whole range of people who have been targeted and prosecuted under the Espionage Act. He doesn't recognize them as whistleblowers. He doesn't see them as conscientious individuals who have taken risks that they had no choice but to do it because they no longer could go through proper channels. He doesn't put all the blame on the people up in these higher echelons who tried to crush them. He says that they're at fault for what has happened to them. And I don't think you should trust somebody who's an attorney in DC who claims to represent whistleblowers, who is on the side of apologizing for the way that the government uses the Espionage Act to go after individuals.
Yeah, and I believe I want to be careful here. I believe he point blank says he does not represent people who go to the media in violation of
He's pretty much against that. He
He
wants
is
to only represent people who will keep things private and go. He wants to organize meetings and be an arbitrator or be a voice in there that can say, let's say, for example, I'll just use a hypothetical situation. So let's say there's somebody at the NSA who has uncovered that a FISA warrant was obtained improperly. Well, what Mark Zaid's fantasy is that he's going to go into a room with that person and then their supervisor, and he's going to sit there and they're going to talk it out and come to an agreement of how to resolve this issue so that it gets fixed inside the agency. But we never learn about it. Let's be very clear. In that meeting, after it's over, there is secrecy. We never know what was done, and we don't know what abuse of power was happening.
And with Jeffrey Sterling's meetings with the Senate Intelligence Committee, I believe Mark Zaid had to leave the room because he didn't have a clearance for it.
Yeah.
So
okay.
he won't actually be there.
All right. So here's one more thing, and then we'll get to I want to hear your story about Holden. But we've got one more thing from Mark here, and this comes at the 125 mark. This is so it's very much near the end of the question and answer. And here he's talking about the collateral murder video.
Mean because it's classified, it can be revealed as a matter of law. And there are harms that can come. They're set by executive order. They're vague as to figure out what it means when you disclose secret information, top secret information, sensitive compartmented information. And with the WikiLeaks Manning disclosures, there's tons of information that was newsworthy and you can say in the public interest for sure. I mean, the Apache helicopter incident, which if Manning had come to me and shown me that, I would have absolutely been able, I believe, to help get that information legally, properly to the right authorities to be looked into as to whether or not anything illegal had transpired in that incident. This was an incident when Reuters reporter was unfortunately, sadly killed by one of our helicopter crews. It was investigated. It was looked at. You can read the 15-6 Army report online. It was determined not to be a war crime. And having worked on war crimes cases, I can understand as a matter of law why it wasn't. Doesn't mean it was palatable. It was very insensitive when you heard what the helicopter pilots were saying. They didn't know who they were shooting at. They thought they were shooting at rescuers of enemy. And you can, under laws of war, kill the rescuers of the enemy because they're looked at as being the enemy. So it's tough. It's not this easy equation of, oh, is it in the public interest? We should reveal it when it's classified information.
Okay, so we're done.
I'd like to read to you from the International Red Cross database on customary humanitarian law. Humanitarian law is the laws of war. Why you would call the laws of killing people humanitarian law, I don't know. The Red Cross is considered the expert on interpreting this. Here's some of their database, the section on medical personnel. And I know he said rescuers, not medical personnel, but we're talking about medical personnel. According to the Geneva Convention, medical teams are not part of the armed conflict. They are marked with distinctive identification signs. They do not carry arms. They do not cause injury, and it is forbidden to harm them. It is prohibited to shoot a paramedic in the battlefield or to take him prisoner. I'm sure his use of the word rescuer and not medical personnel, he thinks, is doing a lot of work here, but this is why double tap drone strikes are illegal under international law. You cannot murder paramedics. His statement about international humanitarian law is flat out false. Second of all, I mean, is collateral murder a war crime or not? I'm of the opinion that it is. The former United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture in his book on Assange, does an analysis of what's depicted and concludes it is a war crime. However, I have heard other people who are pro-Manning, pro-Assange, put the opinion out there that it's not a war crime under the rules of law, but it is just the way war is. That's why war is bad, and that's why this video should be in the public so we can have an informed discussion about whether or not we want to engage in war in Iraq or not, if it means carrying out acts like this. And if you're going to make the point that stuff can only be released if the system itself finds it breaks their rules, then you can never have a discussion publicly about whether or not we, the people, want our government to engage in this type of conduct. And this is the question that I asked of them. And it's so offensive to me what he said, because if he's correct, and I don't think he is, that there was no war crime and collateral murder, that's all the more reason why it should be published, because then that should help inform the public about whether or not we should be involved in war. If war means the lawful murder of Reuters journalists and medics and helpers, then we as a public have a right to decide, should we be doing that? And my answer would be no, we should not be.
Yeah, and he mentions the 15/6 investigation. Well, that means it's the Pentagon investigating its own self, and it's their agency. And we already know from some of the more high-profile incidents in the last couple of years, especially the one that marked the end of our engagement and occupation of Afghanistan. They looked into that aid worker who was assassinated extrajudicially. They killed him, and then they decided that's not a war crime. But there was no justification at all for launching that attack. There's actually been New York Times reporting on units in the military that have been killing people who should not be targeted. And there have been individuals who have tried to kick this up the chain of command to get it dealt with, and they get crushed because those people don't want to do anything to follow up on those allegations, because it'll reflect poorly on those people, those military officers. So no, this again, I have to keep using this word fantasy, this fantasy that you are going to get Chelsea Manning in a room and she's going to talk to these people, or you're going to get into a meeting and they're going to look at this video and scrutinize it, and then they're going to hold themselves accountable so they don't do this again. That's just not how power works. That's not how these institutions work. They don't correct themselves unless they are exposed. At the very least, they don't correct themselves unless they're exposed to some kind of shame. Like, people see the video and there's outrage, and then now they have to respond to it because they're being questioned by members of the press. But even that doesn't really, because that happened with the killing in Kabul of that aid worker, and still, even with all that outrage, it didn't result in them admitting that something wrong was done, that it was a war crime. And so, but I will say also that Chelsea Manning picked rules of engagement files to release to WikiLeaks from Iraq that were accompanying the collateral murder video, and she gave them to WikiLeaks, and they were posted, and they were there so that people could read through them and put them side by side next to the video and see where the rules of engagement were not followed in the video. So I do think that, like, this idea that it is just, oh, it's settled that nothing was done. There was no war crime, even by the laws of war. I don't buy that argument. Yeah.
It's not a settled matter when you have the United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture saying this, who now is at the Red Cross, who has the responsibility for interpreting the laws of war, using his own expertise, saying this was clearly a war crime. And once again, Chelsea Manning wanted to reveal the nature of 21st century war. WikiLeaks wanted to reveal the nature of war. It's not about whether or not these one group of people in this one circumstance followed the rules, right? It's a bigger question about the nature of war itself and about our foreign policy, which there is no official channel for exposing for, right? If the president goes to war and Congress authorizes it, there's no, let me tell the inspector general, did you know war kills people? Oh, okay, we're going to cancel the war now, right? The only thing you have to do is to go to the public and bring them these images and these stories of the battlefield and explain to them what is being done in their name.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I'll just say I'm going to give you the last word by sharing with people your interaction
Yes.
with Holden. But I do want to say, and I got to shamelessly plug my forthcoming book, Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. And I have to just say that, I spent the last better part of this year working on this book for the reasons that have made us feel just batty and delusional from watching this panel. I mean, the things that were said in this panel, it's exactly what I'm trying to counteract with putting together this book, to look at the specific accusations, the attacks, the things that have been leveled against Julian Assange as a journalist, as somebody who engaged in this work, the whole entire WikiLeaks organization, how it was targeted by the CIA. I mean, man, like, we're here at the Hayden Center for Intelligence, which is founded by former CIA director Michael Hayden. And the panel discussion for maybe 3-4 minutes actually deals with the role of the CIA in this case. They glossed over it. They don't pay it any attention. It's as if, even if they could justify it, they don't even want to get into it because it would be bad and reflect badly on what the U.S. Justice Department is trying to do in bringing Assange. But I don't think Assange is facing extradition without the actions of the CIA. That's my narrative. That's what I try to convey in the forthcoming book. But let's hear from you, Chip.
So I'm also going to shamelessly plug my forthcoming book, although it's not going to be out for several years. It's a history of FBI domestic surveillance of a political nature, political surveillance. It discusses the FBI as an intelligence agency from the time of Hoover to the present day. So I was sort of interested in what this FBI counterintelligence official had to say, relevant to my book. So after the panel, and it cost a lot of money to rent the press room, they had wine and beer, not the full press club bar, but enough that they shut out a lot of money. And crudité, Dr. Oz would have been very happy. There was crudité there, and guacamole. With Joe Biden's inflation, we can only imagine what that cost George Mason University, plus the markup of the press club. And he's talking to two people about the Steele dossier, which is not something that's of immense interest to me. They're arguing with him about it, and he tells them they're all engaged in Russian disinformation. So at this point, I interject into the conversation, and I say to Mr. Triplett, I say, I'm writing a book on the FBI. I'm very familiar with their history. Could you, we're talking, I'm not going to get into the specifics of the Steele dossier, but with the Carter Page warrant, the FBI got in trouble for not following certain guidelines. These guidelines, sorry to get wonky to the listeners and viewers, are called the Woods procedures. And I say to Mr. Triplett, as you know, the reason why the Woods procedures exist is because in September 2000, the FBI admitted to the FISA court they had lied to them on 75 FISA warrant applications. This is pre 9/11. So here they are lying about the FISA applications. They get The only thing they have to do is make their own new protocols, which they don't even follow. So isn't it troubling again and again, we see the FBI commit the same bad acts without any accountability? And he says, oh, there's lots of accountability. Lots of FBI agents go to jail. Only FBI agents that go to jail in this scenario are Mark Felt and his cohort, both pardoned by Reagan. People lose their jobs. And then he says to me, do you know how national security warrants were conducted before FISA? And I say, yes, I do. The Attorney General approved them. And he goes, no, that's not true. I've talked to multiple historians of the FBI. That is true. I say, Mr. Triplett, are you telling me Robert F. Kennedy didn't sign off on the MLK wiretap? He goes, that wasn't a national security warrant or wiretap. It was. This is irrelevant, but I'm just pointing out how bad his history is. He says, okay, so I say, okay, Mr. Triplett, how did the FBI conduct wiretaps before FISA? He goes, illegally, because they had no other choice. Because if they went to a court of law, the Soviets would have read the warrant application. Between like 1933 and 1968, all wiretap evidence is inadmissible in court. So the process he is describing doesn't even exist for most of this time period. But his point being is that the FBI only engages in illegal actions when they have no other choice. And like, fine, this is already creepy. And and then he's going on like, men like my father in the FBI, and everybody calls him a Gestapo, but Hoover and all of them were good men just trying to help the country, and sometimes they did the right thing, but we can't let people think they were bad men. They were good men doing the right thing. And I said to him, well, you know, the Church Committee report, it's book 3, but I didn't mention it was book 3 to him, you know, talks about how a lot of the FBI's abuses were driven by the fact that they viewed their role as maintaining the social order and that they were guardians of the status quo. And he goes, that's right. The Soviet Union was manipulating the civil rights movement to sow racial discord in this country, and Hoover and the FBI were afraid our social fabric was unraveling. This is not 1962. This is not 1952. This is in 2022, and he's talking to me about the Soviet Union using Martin Luther King to sow discord in the United States. And he just keeps going, they're good people, but they don't have enough powers. And I start actually getting into with him. I'm not going to do this right now because nobody wants to hear more of my technical details of FBI surveillance, about what powers the FBI have, where they're derived from, and how they can open investigations called assessments without any factual predicate of wrongdoing. And I said, you know, they can't tell civil rights protesters from the Soviet Union are terrorists. They can't tell, they think all protesters are dangerous anarchists. He makes this visceral reaction to me when I say that. And they love to hound Palestinian supporters, right? Everyone who supports Palestine is a terrorist in the FBI. Don't you think the loose guidelines for initiating FBI surveillance, whether these agents are good people or bad people, whether they're a Gestapo or just trying to save us all from, you know, evildoers, don't you think this opens the door for their own political bias to cause them to look at people whom they shouldn't be looking at? And he says, there's a lot of social movements in this country that are good for the nation, but there are other social movements that are just riled up by foreign interference, and the FBI can't discern between those protesters who are good people and those who are under the influence of foreigners, and it's their job to find out which is which. I mean, this is insane. This is straight out of Hoover, and he's defending Hoover. And this man is not like a low-ranking FBI guy. He was the director of counterintelligence for the National Security Council, and he now runs a private firm that offers risk assessments to private corporations and writes all these articles for Lawfare about the threat that Chinese economic espionage poses to U.S. businesses, the implication being you need to go hire his service if you're a CEO.
Yeah. That's what he's doing. Yeah. I mean, we could have, he was just very nearly about to tell you that the Negro sees red. I mean, that's about where Holden was at.
Yes. Yes. And he could put in caveats like, and they hurt people wrongly or they went too far, but he would not concede that the FBI, he didn't deny the FBI spied on the civil rights movement, but he would not concede that it was motivated by anything else, by the fact that the Soviet Union was manipulating the civil rights movement in order to sow racial discord, because everybody in Alabama would have been happy to be terrorized and lynched by the Ku Klux Klan unless, Joseph Stalin said, "Oh, this is terrible." I mean, it's shocking to me, and it completely discredits and discounts anything he has to say on anything else. And as I pointed out, this man was likely the director of national counterintelligence while they were engaged in these quote unquote offensive counterintelligence activities against Julian Assange that entailed kidnapping and plots of assassination, which someone on that panel should have brought out, as opposed to asking him the non-rehearsed question of should they register as a foreign agent.
All right. Well, Chip, you very kindly have agreed to contribute an article to my newsletter, The Dissenter, that will be something a little bit more tidy and put together, especially for those who aren't going to watch hour-and-a-half videos that break down the clips. This will be a little bit more of a comprehensive overview of this panel discussion and what it represents, so people can look for that. Maybe even those who watch this video will appreciate seeing your writing as well. You have to go. We have to end this broadcast, but I do want to just put an exclamation point on this. The reason why we spend so much time talking about these people, even though their arguments are bonkers, is because, both Mark Zaid and Holden, I mean, look, Brock, Cooper, names like that, they just send off alarm bells. Holden Triplett. The reason why we talk about these people is because they are people who have feet in the national security apparatus. They have interactions all the time. And up to this point, most of the events that we would see scheduled, you can correct me if you've seen something else going on in DC, but most of the time, the people who are on these panel discussions are sympathetic to dropping charges against Assange, or they're talking about the press freedom and human rights issues that are intertwined in this case. They may not be friendly to Julian Assange, but they sure recognize that if this is to go forward, there will be a precedent that would be bad for the country when it comes to civil liberties and other things that are important to citizens of the US and the world. And so now you have Hayden Center stepping forward and saying they're going to sponsor this. And you've got people who are defenders, apologists who are pro this prosecution from the Justice Department. And it comes at a very pivotal time because you have Christian Harafson, who is saying, he's the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief. He's saying that it could be weeks, maybe a few months before Julian Assange is put on a plane and brought to the U.S. and put on trial. And so I think it says a lot. And I think maybe this is a preview of what's to come, that as we get closer and closer to that moment that we don't want to happen, that could very well happen, where Julian Assange is put on a plane, you're going to see these national security state people come out of the woodwork, and they're going to talk and they're going to speak, because they know that if this is happening in DC, it's going to look bad for the United States. So they're going to have to find some way to make it seem like an outlier and make it seem like it's not something that represents a direction the U.S. is going that is anti-freedom of the press.
And hopefully, Kevin, next time I'll see you, you'll be at the National Press Club. I can't say more than that. But
yeah, okay. And it won't be with the Hayden Center.
That was a surprise, Kevin. That's for the audience. No, it will not be.
I'll have to keep you in suspense. It'll be some other organization. Actually, I'm shooting for a Raytheon-connected think tank that I can talk about Assange.
Somebody paid for that open bar in Crudité at this event.
Okay. All right, everyone. We really appreciated talking to you.
Bye.
There's been some really good animated chat. People have been following along. I thank you if you were here live watching. And we'll be back soon with another broadcast.
Excellent. Have a good one.